Good morning, everyone. Morning. Thank you for coming through today. Thank you very much, Robert, for being here today. At least, even though there's a small group, we will have this on video, so it will go. You will get some coverage. I have heard Robert speak, not this particular talk before, so I think we're in for a very good morning with Robert. Robert works for Eskom. He's a resilience officer. I don't know if that's correct, but the manager that looks after all our load shedding and makes sure that Eskom actually does carry on running, because without load shedding things would collapse. So I don't know quite about what your presentation's about today, but it's very interesting, the intricacies of, we all hate load shedding, but without it in the state that we are, Eskom would collapse, and we'd have no it. But Robert's is an absolute expert on that. Robert's also got his master's in engineering from Stellenbosch, so very well qualified, and has got a lot of awards nationally and internationally. Thank you very much for being with us today, Robert, and we're really looking forward to your talk. Thank you. Thanks.
It's really great to be here. I was here the first time when Simon spoke last time. So I've stolen one of his slides just to give you some continuum. But it's great to have met some of you now over breakfast. The Netcare team is quite close to me. As I said, when I saw the Netcare sign there, I realized, I work with one of their team, Mandy, and she's on my critical stakeholder list, so tends to know before anybody else when we're going to be load shedding. I'm not going to be talking about load shedding today. What I'm going to be speaking about is this idea of what it's like to be a human being, specifically focusing on these three things. When we look at the systems that we're involved in, the companies, the organizations, what does it mean to be in a space where there's this churn of uncertainty, this change that's going on, and this need for transformation? So my very first question is, what does it feel like? That feeling of being in a space where since 2008, when we had that first batch of load shedding, when it became quite apparent as to where we were on a knife edge at that time, in fact, we couldn't guarantee that the system would stay up. Now that's what load shedding does now. Load shedding has been implemented since then in a very rigorous way. So even when we were at stage 4 load shedding, the system was still safe. But the point is, that's like 10 years ago. And for 10 years, in Eskom, we've seen this churn. So we've had leadership crises, we've had the state capture crisis, we've had coal crises, we've had all kinds of things. So to be in that space has actually been a really fascinating thing, to see people work with this. And that's really what my talk's about, picking up some of the things that have been coming through. We all have heard this particular thing: change is the new normal. The question is, to what degree do we have the tools to do something with that? And so my team is grappling with what are the tools that we can help people work through some of these issues with, whether it's an acute disaster or whether it's just this chronic ongoing churn in the organization. And that's really what I'd like to speak to you about this morning, rather than the technical things which I do sometimes speak about. So this has been quite a journey. I'm going to weave in some of my favorite authors. My top favorite author is Rebecca Solnit. She's got this lovely quote. She says, "When you recognize uncertainty, you recognize that you may be able to influence the outcome. To embrace the unknown and the unknowable is an alternative to the certainty of optimists and pessimists." And we all know those people. Everything will be fine, and then it isn't. And, everything is just falling apart, and it isn't. So it's putting yourself in the space between those and saying there's huge uncertainty. But whether it's a leader in an organization, whether it's somebody anywhere in the organization, I can play a role in that uncertainty. And that's really what this talk is about. The way we think about the world determines how we live in it and how we act in it. One of the things that has intrigued me since I was a student, I read a book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Anybody read that? There's something in the book that fascinated me, is this idea of how you engage with technology. What are the tools we're working with? How we master this idea of working in uncertainty. If you look at the way that artists, for example, deal with uncertainty and the tools that they use and the way of thinking, it's all about working in a space where you don't really know what's going to come out. You're actually involved in the process in the studio in coming up with these things. Similarly to musicians, and especially jazz musicians. The real jazz fundi won't buy a CD. The only place to listen to jazz is in the club, because it's all about how the musician responds to the people, to the other musicians, to the room. So what are the tools that we can use in our environments in a way that we can improvise, where we're able to be in this world, where it's uncomfortable sometimes, but it can be quite exhilarating when we find ways through the uncertainty with change or the disruption. So, being risk practitioners, I assume most of you are. But let's talk about risk, and let's talk about risk management. So if we look at the definition of risk, it's the impact of uncertainty, or the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So what's risk management? What is the two primary things you're looking at when you're managing the risk? Number one, you're looking at what are the causes that I need to address. And number two, what are the controls that I need to have in place to manage those causes? I'm going to ask the question, and you're going to see why I ask that question in a moment. What if we don't have access to what all those causes are? And what if the idea of controlling something doesn't work in some spaces? In other words, if we can maybe influence, but we can't control. What does that do to our level of certainty that we're trying to achieve by managing the uncertainty and the impact on our objectives? And you'll see in a moment why I'm asking that question. The other thing I want to ask is this thing about an objective. Perhaps we should start with questioning what the objectives are. And you'll see why I ask that in the presentation as well. This is a lovely quote, and I'm going to come back to Netflix in a moment. When you view the world as a system, the idea of a cause becomes meaningless, because there's no way to isolate the individual cause. Instead, the world is a tangled web of influences. So these are guys who are working in the space of software, very intricate software systems, and human beings. So it's that interface. The next thing I want to talk about is two worlds. The world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking. I'm going to start with where I was as an engineer a few years ago. I came out of university fresh into ESCOM, and my world looked like this. I'd been trained that the world is a causal space. In other words, you cause something, things interact because we cause them, and we can figure out how that works. Also, that the world is linear. In other words, I don't have to expect really strange things to happen when I cause them. Thirdly, that the systems that I work with are bounded. In other words, I can step outside of them. You know, if I put a Boeing 747 in a hangar to work on it, I can leave and I can come back and it's still there and nothing's changed. It's a bounded system. And that means that I can apply a lot of rational thinking to what's going on. I can work out how the system works and how I should be working within it. It also means that I can predict what's going to happen when I start working with that system. I can also talk about controlling the system. So now we're comfortable in that risk space. What I can also do is I can set goals and to say, okay, for the system, this is what I want to do in setting those goals. I can put plans in place in order to meet those goals. I can specify specific tasks related to each of those plans. And I can rely on the past. I've got all this experience of working on, let's say, a 747, as I said earlier. I can rely on that experience to get me better and better and better in that space. And if I can't, if for some reason there's a problem, I can call in the experts. We can look at case studies, because a case study is a thing I can transport from wherever and bring it into the hangar here and work with the case study there. I'm able to analyze everything in detail. I can find out how things connect, and I'm able to reduce things to small enough things that I can dish them out to have everything done. So I've heard a really nice analogy in the past, which is, this is like if you're an alien and you came in here and you saw a clock lying on the ground. You'd be able to figure out what this thing does. Take it apart. After a while, you'd figure out what it does, even though it's a thing you've never seen before. Okay, so for anybody that has been a parent or been involved in bringing up a family, you'll understand my next question, which is, so does that model of the way the world worked apply to a family situation? All of those things I've just said. What I'm going to be talking now is this world of human systems. And in this particular world, one of the things I'm speaking about a lot is the fact that we as human beings are variable. In other words, when we're at work, some days we are great, some days we're struggling. You can already see how different that is to the Boeing in the hangar. The Boeing is just going to wait there for me to come back to it. The way we engage with each other is we don't engage with data. We tend to talk about, this is what's happening, this is how I feel about it. So that's the kind of creatures that we are. We're also involved in a lot of rituals. Even just saying good morning influences the way that we interact with each other. And we're also these incredibly creative human beings. And finally, the one thing a machine can't do is care. We care about where we are, we care about our families, we care about our work situations, even when they're difficult and they're going through the change or uncertainty and disruption. When my team looks at how we respond to emergencies, there's some great work that's been done on emergency management where people are saying, so why are some teams really good at it and some teams struggle at it? And this one term that has come out is a thing called a sense of coherence. And what that means is basically three things. The first one, that I'm able to make sense of what's happening around me. In other words, I've got ways of figuring out, okay, we're going into load shedding again. How do I understand what is happening, why it's happening? Secondly, do I have a sense of meaning? When we were at stage 4 load shedding, I was in the control room and I sat there looking at what was happening, realizing the impact on the country, but also realizing that we could have been a Venezuela had our load shedding not worked. Venezuela had no electricity for about 6 days. The system was taking strain, but the system was safe. We weren't at risk of a national blackout. So the first thing is being able to make sense of what's going on. The second one is to be able to find a sense of meaning or purpose. And the third one, they work together, is, do I have a sense of agency? Do I feel I can do something in this space? Who's able to help me? I always tell the story of when we were in load shedding in 2014. We're taking over 200 trucks up to fill the diesel at Ankerlig. And we were struggling to get through the traffic. I picked up the phone and I called Colin. He's the head of disaster management in the Western Cape. And I said, Colin, can you help us? And he said, sure, what do you need? And I said, well, we need metro support. So he arranged very quickly metro support to get our trucks through. Now that's just simply based on our relationship, our connection, and one phone call. If you're an emergency responder, can you see that these things are all going to make sense? How do I make sense of what's going on right now? It's dynamic, it's moving. How do I find meaning in what's happening? But also, what agency and what connectedness do we have in that space? And what's interesting is it doesn't have to apply to emergencies. It can apply to anything. Okay, it can apply to where you're uncertain about your future. It can be where you're in a situation of change. So now I'm going to ask a question, and it's a question that sat with me when I read a book by Michael Puett. He's a Harvard professor, and he was looking at Chinese ways of thinking about the world. What he was essentially asking was, from our Western mindset, we tend to see the world as ordered, as deterministic, as predictable. If it isn't, let's try and get it there. Let's close the gap. Now that's one way of thinking about the world. And it comes all the way from Plato and Descartes, the philosophers that kind of did that thing. They sort of separated themselves from the world. In fact, they separated the mind. Descartes he's the guy who says, I think, therefore I am. So he's gone right into his mind and separated his body even from his mind. Later philosophers have turned that around. But the question that Michael Pewitt asks is, so what if we looked at the world as being messy, fragmented, and broken? In other words, that is what the world is. It is that. To try and believe anything else is just working with the wrong assumptions. And the question is, so what do you do then? How do you manage in a space that looks like that? To me, this is the question that we need to be asking if we're talking uncertainty, change, and disruption. And then there's one of my favorite quotes here, because now I'm leading into where I want to go here, which is, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And I'll give you a really fun little example just now, just as sort of a metaphor for that. But before we get there, remember we spoke about a world which is ordered, that sort of space where we can predict things. I'm going to take you into a different kind of world now. And the really exciting thing is that this world is really accelerating. Pretty much every university is now starting to sprout all kinds of work in this space. What's also exciting, because remember that when I spoke about that mechanized sort of view of the world, means I can break everything down, which means I can have an engineering department, electrical engineering department, computer engineering department. I can break it all down, and people can come out with these degrees saying, I do this in this space. What this space is doing is a lot of universities now creating transdisciplinary research spaces, because they're saying maybe the world isn't so categorized. Maybe we need to be working together. So let me take you into that, the world of complex adaptive systems. So these systems are very different to what I've just spoken about. We're looking at many different components. So they're different, they're not the same thing. There's a lot of unknown interactions. And you can see what I've done there. I've highlighted the fact that some of them might never be discoverable. We've all been in that room where something's going on, but we don't know why. In other words, I can't analyze it and discover it. These things interact through feedback. When the temperature goes up, I sweat to cool me down. That's a good example of negative feedback. It's helping me manage the system. Good example of positive feedback is global warming. Depletes the ice caps, they break up, and it accelerates global warming because of the permafrost that creates more carbon in there. These systems work across scales as well. You've got all kinds of different levels, from the person working right at the bottom who could make quite a significant impact on the system at a much higher level. These systems are open to the environment. Things are happening to that system that you can't keep away. There's no hanger around the 747. The system is being influenced and being affected by things outside of that. If you engage certain people around whatever it is in the organization, those people would be able to leverage a much different response than other people. There's layers of systems. There's distributed control in these systems. These systems can't be reduced to their bits. So you have to look at them as the whole rather than the sum of the parts. If we look at how these systems work, there's constant change going on. Compare your team, for example. Friday, you guys have a really good party. Come Monday morning, the vibe is completely different. Something's happened on the weekend and it's different. That 747 is just waiting for you to come back, pick up the screwdriver and start working on it. Two very different worlds. There's non-linear dynamics. I can do a little thing here and whoops, something really big happens over there. Very sensitive to initial conditions. So where we start out, if we started out slightly differently, we might end up somewhere completely different. It's got domains of stability, and the best way of describing this is you can have an area of land that's flourishing, and then if something happens and it gets shifted into the space where it becomes, let's say, arid, a drought, it's very difficult to get it out of that. So it's stable there, but it's not a great space to be in. These systems, you get these things called tipping points. I think a good example there is Greta Thunberg, one of my big heroes. She's stepped into a system that is ready to change. These systems are fundamentally unpredictable. Remember, we spoke about it being able to predict. You actually can't predict what's going to be happening with them. You can only look back. And this is really interesting, this word, retrospective coherence. I'm looking back and I'm saying that makes sense. Putting a story on what's happened, which might not be what actually happened. How did Eskom get to where we are? You can ask multiple people and get completely different, coherent stories. But they're all different. From the risk management perspective, there are no real causes. And there's all kinds of things happening. They're all contributing to this. And you don't know how they're interacting on a given day. Things change suddenly. It's not just adapting the system. These systems, you can't go back. You know, if I take the wrong panel off the 747, I just put it back and I work on the other one. Here, once you've dealt with people, something's happened, you can't go back. So it's path dependent. What I choose to do now is going to influence where I am forward. So this whole system is carrying its history in it. Often you hear, can we just put the past aside? Can we just say, you know, the past is done, apartheid's finished, can we just move on? We can't do that. We're in a hugely complex system. And the history will stay with us for a very long time. So then there's three things that come out of these systems. The one is they're self-organizing. There's things happening in the system all the time. And this results in something called emergence. Suddenly the whole system takes on something that nobody expected. And then finally, very importantly, these systems are always full of surprises. And there will be failures. And we need to work with that. It is what it is. But can you see it's a different world to the one that I spoke about earlier? To summarize it, you're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic. So the one is like a dualist picture of the world, it's me against the traffic. The other one is I'm actually in this. I'm part of the system, I'm part of the traffic. The only real model of a complex adaptive system is the system itself. Anyone in software here? So, the idea of sandbox, you know what that is. Okay, sandbox is the thing where you test your systems. Netflix doesn't test their things in the sandbox to see how it's working because it's so complex that to replicate it in the sandbox to make any sense of what the real world looks like doesn't make sense. So they fiddle around with the main system. Very deliberately, very specifically, they introduce latency errors and all kinds of things to see what will happen to the system. Because the only real model of the system is the system itself. Think about that as a radical way of thinking about your world. Because it doesn't help if you've done all the work in the sandbox and it doesn't actually represent reality. Okay, so this to me is one of the most pertinent things to think about when you're working with complex adaptive systems. We work with the evolutionary potential of the present. It is what it is right now. The only thing we can do is start walking in a certain direction together. The evolutionary potential of the present is the thing where you say, let me try a few experiments. One of them will fail, two of them will fail, perhaps all of them will fail. Let me try an experiment that I know will fail. In fact, I might learn more from that than the ones that I thought might work. These aren't pilots. For those of you that are thinking, well, it sounds like a pilot. A pilot, everybody's invested in making sure it works. With an experiment, you're saying, it doesn't matter if it fails. I'm there to learn something from it. Okay, so let's just talk about a very quick picture of some of these systems. And you'll notice the word socio because I'm talking about human systems. We have socio-technical systems, Eskom, for example, socio-economic systems, socio-political systems, and socio-ecological systems. In other words, how we are in the environment, what we do to the environment as human beings. And the thing is, these things all overlap, and they're all interwoven. Have a look at that and just think about those things I said earlier. Socio-ecological. Perhaps from a political point of view, normally the municipality wants a stamp on something. Okay, there's a certain governance that needs to work. You're in an economic space here. It's cheap. Perhaps there's no insurance involved. Is your insurance company going to cover you? And then finally, there's a whole lot of technology involved. There's obviously the chainsaw. I'm assuming it's the chainsaw. But then there's the whole cell phone network that's allowing this to work. Okay, so you can see that these systems are now all linked. So every time you drive past one of these, if you can remember the talk. I'm now going to talk to the second part of this talk. We've just spoken about those two worlds. I love this definition. Resilience is the science of dealing with surprise. Okay. This chap over here, Buzz Holling, was very involved in the ecological side of resilience, but I love that. It's the science of dealing with surprise. Resilience is a verb. It's not a thing you have. It's a thing you continually aspire to. How do I persist? When I have a storm, are our networks able to deal with that, especially with climate change coming? If the network collapses, how quickly can I re-establish it? I might need to do some adaptation, and I hinted it to you now. We might need to strengthen our networks so that as climate change kicks in, that there's not such a big impact. And then finally, perhaps we need to transform completely. Each of those are an aspect of resilience that we need to be thinking about. My team's done some work on two things. The one is, what is specified resilience? There's certain legislation, compliance things that we need to do, and there's certain good practices, business continuity, disaster management. From a technical perspective, we can design redundant systems that's specified, and we can have general technical resilience, which means that there'll be no more load shedding if we all had smart meters. So I'm able to do all kinds of things, whatever happens on the network, if I've got that capability. At a social level, I've got specified resilience. Those are the structures that my team puts in place. Those are the business continuity plans. Those are the things that we do if we need to respond to something. And then finally, what is general social resilience? And that's the thing I'm focusing on here, which is to say, how do we deal with the issues of how our thinking is, our culture, and those connections that we have. So now let's talk about accidents. So when these things go wrong. And I think this is where we start discovering our thinking about systems. So I'm going to contrast two kinds of systems. The first one is this dualist way of looking at the world. It's either right or wrong. It's the mind versus the body. So the first time the word human error came about was somebody who was analyzing in 1931. He was analyzing all industrial accidents. Came to the conclusion you only have two kinds of errors, technical or human error. And if it's not technical, then it has to be human error, and vice versa. Okay, now remember I said earlier the history of a system sits in there. This person's job was what? And I'm saying that because I realize some of you might be from there. In the insurance industry. Wanting to decline claims where people did things to themselves. So if you can label it as human error, I think he had 88% of errors were human errors. There's a whole new world at the moment that looks at industrial accidents and said that model is actually not what works in this complex space. Any accident is an emergent outcome of a whole lot of influences. Some are discoverable, and it comes down to this thing of human variability. You can have accidents where everybody is doing exactly what they've been told to do. You can also have cases where people are doing exactly what they shouldn't be doing, but you don't have an accident. So this is what I was speaking about earlier, retrospective coherence. I can go back, and depending on who I am, whether I'm management, whether I'm the trade union, whether I'm the individual, whether I'm the insurance company, and I might well construct a different story as to what happened there, simply because that's my way of thinking about the world. So we're starting to get some clues as to what some of the problems are about our old ways of thinking of systems. And I like this quote again: history is a fiction we invent to persuade ourselves that events are noble and that life has some sort of order and direction. In other words, all of that colorful stuff I spoke about, that we can push that aside and say, I can explain what happened. You know, if only that person had not done this. But you've got to ask yourself, why would they crash an aircraft or an oil rig? in that context. Okay, so there's this thing about, and the Netflix guys are very clear about that in their minds. They say there is no such thing as root cause, because there's no causes anyway. Everything's just influences working together. But I've heard one very prominent accident investigator say, yeah, there is one root cause, and that's management. It's quite a powerful statement, because when you're dealing with these systems, it's all about how you're responding in real time to what's happening. How I'm responding to what's going on around me becomes very important. And what's the job of management? Job of management is to put a control in place and to get feedback. How often as management is there certain feedback we don't want? It's inconvenient. We don't want to hear it from that person. As soon as we start doing that, we're setting ourselves up for potentially a big accident. So if we're not allowing both of these things to be happening, and this person, her way of modeling accidents, she basically models the whole accident by each actor in this thing and saying, what was your responsibility? How did you take feedback? We often don't ask that question. How open were you to feedback? Okay, so the control, the feedback, and what you end up with is management imagines how work is being conducted versus understanding how it's actually being conducted. And that has implications when things go wrong. How do we then learn? We've got to learn fast. We've got to learn in real time. We've got to correct. We've got to put in new controls, correct, new controls, correct, new controls, correct. One way of learning rapidly is to perhaps not talk about failure. Maybe to change the language, because language is very important. If I use the word unexpected surprise, which means I don't actually know what's happening with the system right now. Why would it do this, even though it's a great thing? Those are the things we don't investigate. But perhaps we should. If it's something's gone wrong, it's also an unexpected surprise. And then what we need to be asking is not why did this happen and whose fault is it, but how did this happen? How is it that these decisions happened on the day? Because we're wanting to find out how work is really done, as opposed to imagining how it should have been, and everyone will play along with us if they know that there's going to be some consequences. There's two gurus in this space. There's Eric Holnagel and David Woods, and he's got three things he says. Resources are finite. Surprise is fundamental. It will always be there. And change never stops. Coming to Netflix. So when you see this coming up, I'd also like you to remember what they do in this space. They adhere to everything I've just said now. They don't ask why. They sit next to somebody and they say, so how did this happen? In fact, this is another quote from their job advert. Following an operational surprise, we seek to understand what the world looked like from the perspective of the people involved. So we facilitate interviews, analyze what's happened, produce artifacts like written narrative documents, and relationship building is a huge part of this. In other words, not destroying relationships. We're not wanting everybody to go and defend each other. We actually want to get everybody around to understand what happens so that it doesn't happen again or doesn't happen in the same way again. Coming now to the last part, I spoke about being. And the question I ask is, what makes us human? What is it that we bring to work? What is it that we bring when we engage with these kind of systems? And the first thing is that we see things not as they are, but as we are. If you want to make sure that you're dealing with this rationally, that you're able to analyze what's going on, there's a whole lot of blind spots you've got to deal with. And so if you can tick all of those off, you're in a pretty good space to approach this world in a very analytical way. Let's talk about experts. So another category of human being is an expert. In a complex system, the problem with experts is that they've been designed, their whole thinking has been designed to look for certain things. There's this great experiment done with radiologists. They were asked to identify cancer nodules in these x-rays. What they weren't told was there was a 43 times the size of a cancer nodule that they were looking for, a gorilla imprinted into this x-ray. 83% of them didn't see it, and most of the 17% who did see it were convinced afterwards by their colleagues that they hadn't seen it. It was just too unlikely. So what does that mean? Where do the possibilities lie? We bring in the experts, they'll be looking for the average thing. They're looking for what the average cancer nodule looks like. It's that big, it's not 43 times, and it looks like a gorilla. We are looking for the outliers. What is that thing that's starting to happen over there? Whether it's the Uber or the Netflix, and these things could materialize as really big missed opportunities or as serious threats to the organization. What can we do to work in these kind of systems? And I think this is where we go back to it is what it is. Let's look at ourselves as human beings. So one of the things we can do is work with the fact that we are storytellers. And that has two implications. The one is let's work with those stories. Stories are like warm data representing cold facts. If you don't change the way people describe the past and the present, you haven't got a new future. You need to find out what's happening in your company right now that is a really good story. Let's take that story and amplify it. Let's find ways of supporting what's happening there. And where's a story that's starting to cause trouble? Let's dampen it. Maybe stories are just data with a soul, another version of what I said just now. Now I'm going to ask you to participate in something if you haven't, which is this. I could have used the Eskom examples. We've done this for safety, for operations. We do it all the time, every time we have a big exercise. Essentially, we're working with what we call human sensor networks. We're asking for stories, in other words, embodied emotional responses to what's happened. And then we look at ways of analyzing that, but not by bringing in experts. We ask the people to analyze those stories themselves. So we've currently got a project under the Public Sector Committee. We proposed this. This has now become part of the overall risk report. It'll be in there. So the first thing we ask is, think about something in the risk space where something either went very wrong or went very right. And just have a look at these cartoons and see which one you relate to. Just chosen this one here. Okay. Then we're going to ask you to describe your story just briefly, in a way that you experienced it, and then to give it some sort of name. So the name I chose here, as you can see, nobody saw it. Yeah. Then we get to the really interesting part, because now we're going to ask you to analyze, and this isn't a survey. You know, the problem with a survey is if I don't like my manager and I get my 360-degree survey, I know exactly what to do with that 360 survey. Wouldn't it be helpful if we had a survey which I cannot gain? I don't know what it should be, so I'll just go to what it is. So in my story, your decisions about what to do were guided by intuition. Rational analysis and expertise were the thing that we focused on. Or we focused on governance and rules. So in this disaster, or in this real success, where were you focused on? And then we'll ask you to position your dot over there. And it's an embodied, when you do it, you kind of feel, oh, I'm moving this thing here. Oh, no, I'll move it here. Okay, you'll experience that. And then we also ask some of these, but these aren't good or bad either. In this story, I was focusing on having the right answers, or was I focusing on responding quickly? And then finally, there's a couple of questions around what we're really looking for is, what are the areas that we should be improving as a risk community? So this is a way of engaging with risk management in the country as a whole. So it's part of what we call a human sensor network. The idea is not a once-off survey. In fact, the companies that use this the most effectively are doing it all the time. Because then you can find the good stories, the bad stories, and you can say, what do I need to do to extract some of these good stories and make them good stories everywhere? Okay, so now we're working with emotional being, not just the rational being that sometimes surveys deal with. I'm also wanting in these systems for people to use their imagination. Koch and Kathleen Sutcliffe, they've done some work on highly reliable organizations, things like nuclear power stations, aircraft carriers, and the like. They say if you don't have the imagination to imagine what, if this thing goes wrong, what it would look like, you're not going to be making the right decisions. How do we make it happen in organizations? So what my team does, you might use the word exercise. What you're doing is you're basically getting in a room and saying, we're now going to pretend, we're going to make as if we're in this massive emergency. 2 months ago, we looked at a massive cyber attack across Eskom. We had 220 people in a room, a whole new format. Everybody could talk to each other, learn together, and that's what the role of ritual is in this context. They're transformative, because when you step out of the space of doing that ritual, something's changed in you. You don't come out of these things the same. And then finally, this thing of collective creativity. Remember I said we need to question the objectives. We tend to underestimate how widely we need to spec our objectives. What happens is the most amazing thing when you say, let's add objectives. And the first objective, by the way, is your values as a company. You extend your objectives, you get more people in a room, and suddenly you get these amazing results. But basically our objectives need to face the complexity that we're facing. A singular objective is not going to get us to the point of, in fact, it might even break the system. The thing you are doing now affects the thing you're going to be doing next. And that's where this move in project management, and again, it started in the software world. From waterfall projects, this date to that date, we're going to do X activity and we'll plan it 5 years ago, to more sort of cyclic responses. And where we are at the moment, we're doing little sprints. We're going to do this for this week. We're doing multiple safety fail experiments. And we're going to have a deliverable at the end. And we're going to check what that looks like. If it looks great, and we start working with it. If it doesn't work out, that's fine. But we've learned in the process. We see in order to move, we move in order to see. Remember I spoke about artists. That's what they do. So an insight into where we are. We're going through this massive transition. You guys saw it the last 2 days, the plans and the medium-term budget and all of that. And by the way, I must just say, I see a lot of people are cynical about Eskom doing it. It's real, it's happening. We're getting all the blocks sorted out, and we are moving. Okay. So my team, there was a long time where nothing was happening and we didn't know, and this massive uncertainty. And we decided we're going to focus on this thing. How do we find a sense of coherence in what's happening? This malaise, this sort of liminal space where we've left, but we're not sure even if we're in the right space. This is just a photograph from the space in which we do our agile stuff, our Kanban boards and all of the things that you guys who do it. And there you can see some of the things we speak about. Over here we've got, that's our focus here, the sense of coherence that I spoke about earlier. We've got 3 objectives here which sound counterintuitive. As we unbundle, we want to be more integrated and more connected as people. Because let me tell you, if you unbundle the organization and you have to respond to a national blackout, you've lost all your connectivity. Okay? So we need to find ways of keeping that, even though the organization is eventually shifted outside of Eskom. These are our 3 heroes in the space. I mentioned Greta earlier. I think she was 16 when she started sitting outside Parliament saying, I'm not going to school because there's no future. Look where she is now. But changing the world rapidly. And Jacinda Ardern, I just loved the way she responded to the shooting in the mosque over there. Nozipho, as a public servant, she won an award last year. She's on the South Coast, Department of Home Affairs. She says, I cannot allow people to come to my office and not be served after waiting the heat and in the queue. So she stays open until the last person served. So in conclusion, what are the tools we use? And I've spoken about complex adaptive systems, resilience thinking. We spoke about storytelling as warm data. We spoke about human sensor networks to find those outliers, those small signals. We spoke about human variability as being something different from human error. We spoke about causes versus influences. We spoke about sense of coherence. We spoke about stimulating human creativity in the midst of this by just looking at, do my objectives match the complexity of what I'm dealing with? We spoke about influence versus control. Ritual as a way of influencing. We spoke about the evolutionary potential of the present. And we spoke about agile just as an example of how we go into the journey without necessarily knowing what the end state is. So I'm going to leave you with the last quote. You'll see it's from a very esteemed doctor, Dr. Zeus. You will come to a place where the streets are not marked. Some windows are lighted, but mostly they're darked. A place you could sprain both your elbow and chin. Do you dare to stay out? Do you dare to go in? How much can you lose? How much can you win? And if you go in, should you turn left or right and 3/4, or maybe not quite? Or go around the back and sneak in from behind? Simple it's not, I'm afraid you will find, for a mind maker upper to make up his, her mind. Thank you very much.